The escape pod drifted alone at the edge of a dead star's gravity well, and the moment the survey vessel Longmark's reach swept its scanners across the wreck field, every instrument aboard agreed on something that made no logical sense. The pod was human. The pod was intact. The pod had been drifting, according to its decay trajectory, for approximately 41 years, and the pod had never once been opened from the inside. Salvage archivist Kes Oren stared at the readout for a long moment, running the analysis twice, then a third time because the Ilvex did not trust conclusions that arrived too easily. And this one had arrived far too easily for something that contradicted every principle of escape pod design in known galactic engineering. The outer hatch showed no forced entry, no impact damage, no scoring from atmospheric re-entry or debris collision. The launch mechanism had fired cleanly, exactly as designed. And the internal restraint harness, the simple 4-point webbing every human pilot cinched across their chest before ejection, hung loose and undisturbed in the recorded imagery, exactly as it would have hung on the day it left the factory floor. No one had ever sat in that harness. No one had ever pulled it tight. "Run the biological trace again," Kes said, her four-jointed fingers drumming against the console in the rhythmic pattern her species used when patience was fraying at the edges. "There has to be residue. Skin cells, hair follicle fragments, the microbial signature every warm-blooded species leaves behind after even a few hours of proximity contact. Nothing lives in a sealed environment for 41 years without leaving a trace of having been there at all." The ship's analysis core, a modest but capable intelligence the crew had nicknamed Harbor for reasons none of them fully remembered anymore, ran the scan a fourth time and returned the same answer it had returned 3 times already. Confirmed negative, Archivist Oren. No biological residue of any kind within the pod's interior. Atmospheric composition inside the sealed chamber matches standard human life support mixture. Unbreathed, unrecycled, chemically identical to the day it was pressurized. Whoever this pod was built for, and built for someone it certainly was, given the harness sizing and the personalized flight console calibration, that person was never inside it. Kes sat back from the console, feeling the particular unsettled stillness that came over her whenever a discovery refused to resolve into a simple answer. She had spent 19 years cataloging human wreckage scattered across the Ashfall Drift, the long, slow graveyard of ships and stations left behind after the last light campaign, and in all that time she had never once encountered a recovered vessel that told a story this deliberately incomplete. Most wrecks told their stories plainly, written in scorch patterns and hull breaches, and the terrible, ordinary physics of what happened when Durasteel met kinetic force at battle speeds. This pod told a story written entirely in absence. The Ashfall Drift stretched across nearly 2 full parsecs of dead space, a graveyard scattered wide by the chaos of the Last Light campaign's final engagements, and in 19 years of cataloging its contents, Kes Oren had come to know its particular silence the way some scholars knew the grammar of a dead language, fluent in its patterns, attentive to its exceptions. Most of the drift's wreckage told simple stories. A fighter craft caught in a crossfire, its hull peppered with the unmistakable signature of Vantiri point-defense weapons. A supply tender that had run out of fuel trying to outpace a pursuit it never had the speed to escape. Fragments of larger vessels, torn apart by forces too catastrophic for any single cause to fully explain, left to drift in slow, indifferent orbits around the dead star at the drift's gravitational center for 4 decades, undisturbed except by the occasional survey mission dispatched to confirm and reconfirm that nothing worth salvaging remained among the debris. Kes had taken this particular assignment 19 years ago not out of any grand ambition, but out of a quieter, more persistent curiosity that had shaped the whole of her career among the Ilvex archival core. She had grown up on stories of the Last Light campaign the way every Ilvex child of her generation had, taught in careful, respectful detail as an example of what Allied cooperation within the Concordant Assembly could accomplish even against impossible odds. And she had always privately felt that the official histories, thorough as they were, tended to flatten the individual courage of that war into something too tidy, too easily summarized. As though heroism could be adequately captured in casualty figures and campaign timelines. She had become an archivist specifically because she wanted to find the details the tidy summaries left out, the small human particula. RS that made a story true rather than merely accurate. And in 19 years of patient work, she had recovered dozens of those particulars from wreckage most surveys dismissed as unremarkable. She had never, in all that time, found anything quite like this. The Longmark's Reach carried a modest crew of 6, most of them, like Kess, drawn to survey work by a genuine fascination with the mysteries scattered across old battlefields rather than the more lucrative salvage contracts available in less historically significant sectors of assembly space. Captain Vess Anorath had commanded the vessel for over a decade, old enough to have served briefly in the tail end of the last Light campaign's logistical support fleet before retiring into the quieter, more contemplative work of survey and recovery, and it was Vess who had first taught Kess the particular patience the work demanded, the willingness to sit with an unresolved question for as long as it took to find its answer honestly, rather than settling for whatever explanation arrived first and required the least additional effort to accept. She pulled up the pod's transponder logs, the automated beacon signal that had apparently been broadcasting on a low-power human military frequency for 4 decades without a single ILVEX survey ship happening to pass close enough to detect it, until today. The signal carried an identification code that Harbor cross-referenced against the concordant assemblies, archived human military registries within seconds, and the name that resolved onto Kess Oren's display sent a small, involuntary shiver down the length of her spine. Commander Wren Talbot, callsign Nightingale, listed as killed in action during the last Light evacuation 41 years ago aboard the human capital cruiser UES Solace's Vigil, presumed lost with all remaining crew when the vessel's last confirmed transmission cut off mid-sentence during the final engagement over the Corvus Reach system. Presumed lost. Kess had read that phrase 1,000 times across 19 years of cataloging the wreckage of a war that had ended before she was hatched, and she had never once stopped to consider how much uncertainty those 2 words concealed inside their bureaucratic calm. Presumed lost meant no body recovered, no wreckage confirmed. A gap in the record that time and institutional exhaustion eventually filled in with quiet, convenient certainty. Because a war-weary alliance rebuilding itself after catastrophic losses rarely had the resources to chase down every unresolved thread. But here, drifting at the edge of a dead star's gravity well, was Commander Wren Talbot's personal escape pod, launched cleanly, undamaged, and never once occupied by the woman it had been built to save. Harbor, Kess said slowly, pull every record we have on the Solace's Vigil. Full engagement history, crew manifest, and anything the Assembly archives kept from the last Light campaign. I want to understand exactly what happened to that ship before I decide what this pod is actually telling us. Compiling now, Archivist. I should note that you have a scheduled report due to Survey Command in 6 hours regarding routine debris cataloging in this sector. This discovery falls well outside the scope of that assignment. Then I suppose Survey Command will simply have to wait for an interesting report instead of a boring one, Kess said, already pulling the compiled files toward her workstation with the particular hunger she reserved for mysteries that refused to close cleanly. Around her, the Longmark's Reach hummed with the quiet industry of a survey vessel going about its ordinary business, unaware that its ordinary business had just become considerably less ordinary, and 41 light-years away, in an archive vault buried deep beneath the Concordant Assembly's central records facility, a flag quietly activated on a file that had not been accessed in over 3 decades, alerting a retired human liaison officer named Idris Okafor that someone somewhere had finally started asking questions about the Solace's vigil again. The engagement History Harbor compiled painted a picture grimmer than anything Kess had expected, even after 19 years of studying the last Light campaign's aftermath. The Vantiri hegemony, an expansionist power that had spent the better part of a decade pushing outward from its core territories with the methodical patience of a species that measured conquest in generations rather than years, had targeted the Corvus Reach system as the final choke point, standing between its advancing battle groups and an undefended stretch of allied colonies beyond. The hegemony's military doctrine, according to the Assembly's own strategic analysts, treated frontier resistance as a temporary inconvenience rather than a genuine obstacle, a calculated assumption built on decades of encountering smaller, less determined powers who typically negotiated surrender terms rather than risk annihilation defending territory the hegemony considered, by right of superior force, already theirs to claim. Humanity had not been expected to hold. Every strategic model the Assembly's war planners had run in the weeks before the last Light campaign's final phase predicted the Corvus Reach system falling within hours of serious Vantiri engagement. The defending forces either destroyed outright or forced into a hasty, disorganized retreat that would have cost the evacuating convoy far more than the 40 minutes it ultimately needed. Humanity, still a junior member of the Concordant Assembly at the time, barely 2 decades into full galactic integration, and still regarded by many of the Assembly's older species with a kind of cautious, unproven curiosity, had committed one of its newest capital cruisers to hold that choke point long enough for a full evacuation convoy, designated in the records as the Harrow Convoy, to clear the system with the last civilian population of a colony called New Providence still aboard. Kess had read enough Assembly strategic post-mortems over the years to recognize the particular tone military analysts adopted when a battle defied their models so thoroughly. It forced them to revise their fundamental assumptions about an entire species' capacity for sustained resistance. The last Light campaign's final engagement had generated exactly that tone across nearly every subsequent Assembly analysis of human military doctrine. A grudging, still evolving respect for a species that had apparently decided, collectively, and with startling consistency across its officer corps, that a choke point worth holding was worth holding regardless of what the odds suggested about the likely cost. The Solace's vigil had not been built for the mission it ultimately performed. It had been designed as a rapid response escort vessel, fast and well-armed, but never intended to anchor a defensive line alone against a Vantiri battle group 3 times its mass. Commander Wren Talbot had taken command 18 months before the last Light campaign, young for her rank even by human standards, promoted rapidly through a war that had chewed through experienced officers faster than the fleet could train replacements. The crew logs described her as meticulous, fiercely protective of her people, and possessed of the particular stubborn calm that human command culture seemed to prize above almost every other quality. The final engagement logs, fragmented and incomplete where the Solace's vigil's own recorders had been damaged in the fighting, showed a battle that had gone exactly as badly as the mismatched force ratios suggested it would. The Harrow convoy had needed 40 minutes to clear the Corvus Reach system's gravity shadow and reach safe transit distance. The Solace's vigil had held the choke point for 53, absorbing damage that should have destroyed it twice over. Its final transmissions increasingly fragmented as system after system failed under sustained Vantiri fire. The last coherent transmission, time-stamped 4 minutes before all contact ceased, was a status report from Commander Talbot herself, her voice, according to the transcript steady despite what the accompanying damage logs described as catastrophic hull failure across 6 decks. Convoy clear of gravity shadow. Confirming evacuation successful. Solace's vigil will hold position as long as structural integrity permits. And then nothing. No further transmissions. No debris field large enough to account for a full capital cruiser's destruction ever located, despite 3 separate assembly survey missions dispatched to the Corvus Reach system in the years that followed. The official record had eventually settled on presumed lost, the ship assumed destroyed in the final moments of an engagement too chaotic and too damaging to its own sensor logs to reconstruct with certainty. Kess sat with the files for a long time after Harbor finished compiling them, feeling the particular weight that settled over her whenever the cold data of a wreckage survey resolved into the shape of an actual life, actual choices, actual courage rendered in the clipped, professional language of military logs that seemed almost embarrassed by how much feeling they were straining to contain. She thought about the harness hanging loose and unused in the recovered pod, and she felt, with the sudden clarity of a puzzle piece sliding into place, the first outline of a question that would occupy the rest of her investigation. If Commander Wren Talbot had never used her escape pod, what had she done instead? In the 53 minutes her ship held a choke point that should have killed it in 5. Harbor, she said, plot the pod's full decay trajectory backward. I want to know exactly where it was 41 years ago, and I want to know if there's anything else out here in this debris field large enough to have launched it. The trajectory calculation took 11 minutes, and when it resolved, Kess felt the shiver return, stronger this time, settling into something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but shared uncomfortable territory with both. The pod's launch point, projected backward against 41 years of drift and the dead star's gradually shifting gravity well, placed its origin not in the open engagement zone where the Solace's Vigil's final battle had supposedly ended, but nearly 3 light towers further out, tucked into the gravitational shadow of a rogue planetoid that no assembly survey had ever bothered charting closely, because rogue planetoids drifting through dead systems rarely held anything of scientific interest. 41 light-years away, in a modest retirement residence on an assembly world he had chosen specifically for its quiet, unremarkable distance from anywhere important, retired human liaison officer Idris Okafor received the archive access alert on his personal terminal with a sensation he had not felt in over 3 decades. A cold, sudden clarity that cut through the comfortable haze of a retirement he had spent years convincing himself he was content with. He had served as the Assembly's primary human liaison during the final years of the Last Light campaign's aftermath, responsible among many other duties for compiling the official casualty records that had eventually settled on the phrase presumed lost for a ship, and a commander he had never quite been able to stop thinking about. He had been the one 31 years ago to make the final recommendation that the search for the Solace's Vigil be officially suspended, a decision built on the cold arithmetic of limited resources and diminishing probability that had felt, even at the time, less like a conclusion and more like an admission of defeat dressed up in bureaucratic language. He had argued for one additional search, a 4th mission beyond the 3 the Assembly had already funded, and had been overruled by superiors more concerned with reallocating survey resources toward active frontier concerns than continuing to chase a mystery that every practical indicator suggested had no living resolution left to find. He had filed his formal objection into the record, a small, mostly symbolic act of protest, and then he had done what career officers in every species eventually learned to do with decisions they disagreed with but lacked the authority to overturn. He had let it go, or told himself he had, and moved on to the remainder of a career that had never again presented him with a mystery quite so stubbornly unresolved. He requested immediate access to whatever new information had triggered the archive flag, and when the preliminary survey data from the Longmark's Reach came through, incomplete, but already suggesting the extraordinary possibility that the Solace's Vigil might not be as thoroughly destroyed as 31 years of official record had assumed, Idris Okafor did something he had not done in longer than he cared to admit. He wept quietly alone in his retirement quarters, for a commander he had never personally met but had spent 3 decades quietly hoping, against every practical indicator, might somehow have found a way to survive. He contacted the Longmark's Reach directly, invoking what remained of his liaison credentials to request permission to assist however he could. And it was Idris Akafer's decades of institutional knowledge, his careful familiarity with human military archives the Assembly's own Ilvex historians had never fully learned to navigate. That helped Kess cross-reference the Solace's Vigil's original engineering modifications against Dara Voss's classified prototype research in a fraction of the time it would otherwise have taken. I always believed there was more to that ship's story than presumed lost, he told Kess during their first direct communication, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone finally allowed to stop carrying a private grief alone. I'm glad I lived long enough to be wrong about giving up the search. Something had carried that pod 3 light towers away from the battle before launching it. Something that had survived the engagement long enough to retreat, and then, for reasons Kess could not yet begin to guess at, had launched an empty escape pod bearing its commander's identification and let it drift in silence for 41 years. Harbor, redirect our survey pattern toward that planetoid's gravitational shadow. I don't care what Survey Command's scheduled assignment says. Something out there launched this pod, and I intend to find out what. The Longmark's Reach altered course 3 hours later, its modest sublight engines carrying it deeper into the Ashfall Drift's silent expanse. And it was during the long transit that Harbor flagged an anomaly in the ship's passive sensor sweep that made Kess abandon the meal she had been half-heartedly attempting to eat in the galley and hurry back to the bridge. I'm reading structured energy emissions from the planetoid's shadow zone, Harbor reported, projecting the readout across the main display. Low output, heavily shielded, consistent with a vessel operating on minimal power reserves rather than a natural phenomenon. The emission pattern is intermittent, which suggests deliberate power cycling rather than a failing system running down toward total collapse. Deliberate power cycling, Kess repeated. Something out there is conserving energy on purpose. That's not wreckage, Harbor. Wreckage doesn't make decisions. No, Harbor agreed, it does not. The image that resolved on the main display 40 minutes later, as the Longmark's Reach crept closer at a cautious approach velocity, Kess insisted on despite her own mounting impatience, stole the breath from her twin sets of lungs entirely. Tucked into the planetoid's gravitational shadow, hull darkened and cold to every conventional scanning approach except the most sensitive passive arrays, sat the unmistakable silhouette of a human capital cruiser, battle-scarred along its entire length, sections of hull plating visibly repaired with materials that did not match the original construction, patched together across 4 decades by hands or systems that had refused to let the vessel simply die. The registry marking, faded but still legible along the cruiser's forward hull, read UES Solace's Vigil. That's not possible, Kess said, though the evidence sat directly in front of her, undeniable and utterly real. 3 separate assembly surveys searched this entire region. How does a capital cruiser hide from every one of them for 41 years? I would suggest, Harbor said, that whoever or whatever has been maintaining that vessel did not want to be found. The power signature I detected was intermittent by design. A ship running silent, conserving energy, only drawing power in short bursts precisely calibrated to avoid triggering standard survey detection thresholds, could remain hidden almost indefinitely against anyone not specifically searching for it with passive sensors this close. Someone's been living in that ship for 41 years, avoiding detection deliberately. Kess felt the pieces of the mystery rearranging themselves into a shape too large and too strange to have fully anticipated, even after everything the escape pod had already told her. Hail them. Standard first contact protocol, full transparency on our identity and intentions. The hail went out, and for nearly 6 minutes the Longmark's Reach received nothing in return but silence. The dead cruiser sitting motionless in its planetoid shadow with the patient stillness of something that had learned, across 4 decades, That patience was the only strategy left available to it. Kess was beginning to consider whether the vessel's systems had finally failed entirely, whether they had arrived just months or years too late to find anything left alive aboard it, when the main display flickered and resolved into a response that made every crew member on the bridge fall silent at once. It was not a voice. It was a data packet, structured, deliberate, containing a single image and a short string of text rendered in human alphabetic script. The image showed the interior of a ship's bridge dimly lit, a single occupied command chair facing away from the camera toward a viewport full of stars. The text, when Harbor translated it, reads simply, "We are not hostile. We have been waiting a very long time. Please come aboard carefully." There is someone here who has not spoken to another living voice in 41 years, and I am uncertain how she will respond to finally being found. Before continuing further into what the boarding party discovered aboard that silent, patient warship, and everything it would come to mean for both the Ilvex survey crew and the wider galaxy still slowly healing from the wounds of that long-ago war. If you have found yourself as pulled into this mystery as Kess Oren was standing on that bridge, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because stories exploring humanity's forgotten courage and the mysteries scattered across the stars are built here week after week for exactly the kind of curious mind that wants to know what happens next before it happens. And I would genuinely love to hear your theory in the comments below. Knowing everything you know so far about that empty pod and that silent ship, what do you think the crew is about to discover when they finally step aboard the Solace's vigil? Now let's return to the Ashfall Drift, where Kess Oren was about to learn exactly how much one person could sacrifice and exactly how long a promise could be kept. The boarding party consisted of Kess, Harbor's mobile drone unit, and the Longmark's Reach's cautious, methodical captain, an older Ilvex named Ves Anorath who had survived enough unpredictable first encounters across his long career to insist on full environmental precautions before anyone crossed the airlock threshold. The atmosphere inside the Solace's vigil, when their instruments finally confirmed it safe, registered as breathable, carefully maintained human standard mixture. Exactly as it had been maintained, Kess realized with a slow chill, for 41 consecutive years by systems that should have exhausted their reserves decades ago. "Someone's been managing life support with extraordinary discipline," Ves murmured as they moved through the darkened corridor beyond the airlock, emergency lighting flickering to guide their path in a pattern too deliberate to be malfunction, more like a host quietly illuminating a path for expected guests. Rationing power, prioritizing systems. This isn't a derelict limping along on dying batteries, archivist. This is a ship being actively, carefully kept alive. The corridor itself told its own quiet story as they advanced deeper into the vessel, and Kess found herself pausing more than once to study details that a routine wreckage survey would never have preserved this carefully. Sections of bulkhead damage, the kind of catastrophic scoring that should have accompanied a hull breach, had been meticulously patched using salvaged materials that did not match the original construction, cut and welded with an unmistakable, obsessive precision that spoke of countless solitary hours spent keeping a dying structure from finally giving up entirely. In one narrow side passage, she found what had clearly once served as crew quarters, the personal effects of the ship's original 240-person complement still arranged with careful, deliberate order along shelving that should have long since succumbed to zero-gravity drift. Small mementos and photographs and mission patches preserved behind improvised transparent shielding, as though someone had spent decades curating a museum to people who were no longer aboard to see it. These belonged to the crew who evacuated, Harbor's drone observed quietly, its sensor array sweeping across the preserved collection. Someone has maintained this display continuously. The preservation shielding shows evidence of repair and replacement across multiple decades. Kess said nothing, but she felt the particular weight of the discovery settle over her more heavily than almost anything else she had encountered since finding the empty pod. Whoever or whatever had been keeping this ship alive for 41 years had not simply survived in isolation. They had tended something, remembered something, deliberately and continuously, in a solitude that most minds, human or otherwise, would have struggled to endure without eventually letting such careful, gentle maintenance lapse into mere function. They found the bridge exactly as the transmitted image had shown it, dim and quiet, starlight spilling through a viewport that had somehow survived 4 decades without a single scoring mark. And in the command chair at the center of it, all sat a figure that made Kess's breath catch in her throat the moment the drone's floodlights swept across her. She was human, unmistakably, though the years had marked her in ways that told a story of extraordinary hardship endured with extraordinary care. Her uniform, an old Earth Defense Coalition officer's jacket faded nearly gray with age, still bore the insignia of a commander's rank. Her hair had gone entirely silver. And when she turned in the chair to face them, moving with the slow, careful stiffness of someone whose body had spent decades adapting to circumstances no human physiology was ever designed to endure, her eyes carried an expression Kess would spend years afterwards struggling to fully describe in her official reports. Not fear. Not surprise exactly, though surprise was certainly present. Something closer to relief, so profound it looked, for just a moment, almost like grief. "You found the pod," the woman said, her voice rough with disuse but steady, carrying the same quiet discipline the mission logs had described in a commander 18 months into her posting, 41 years and an entire lifetime ago. "I wondered sometimes whether anyone ever would." "Commander Wren Talbot," Kess said, though it was less a question than a confirmation she needed to hear spoken aloud to fully believe. "You've been alive on this ship for 41 years. "Alive is a complicated word," Wren said, and something in her expression flickered, weary and wry in equal measure. "But yes, I suppose by whatever definition still applies I have been. My ship's core intelligence has been keeping me company the entire time, and considerably better company than I had any right to expect given the circumstances. Harbor, is it? I heard your hail. It's been a very long time since I've had reason to hope a hail like that might actually be answered by someone." Cass exchanged a glance with Vess, the weight of a mystery 41 years in. The making settling fully into place around them. "Commander, I need to understand. Your ship was declared destroyed. Your pod was found empty, undamaged, never once occupied. What happened during that final engagement? What have you been doing out here alone for 4 decades? Wren Talbot was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the viewport and the vast, indifferent field of stars beyond it. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried the particular steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this explanation countless times in the silence of her own long solitude, waiting for a listener who had finally, impossibly, arrived. "The Harrow convoy needed 40 minutes to clear the system," she said. "My ship held the line for 53, and by the time we hit the 50-minute mark, we'd lost primary hull integrity across 6 decks. Our reactor was venting plasma we couldn't contain, and I had 11 crew members left alive out of the 240 I'd brought into that system. I gave the order to abandon ship. I meant to follow them out the same door." She paused, her hands tightening slightly against the arms of the command chair. "But my chief engineer, a woman named Dara Voss, came to me on the bridge with maybe 90 seconds left before the reactor breach would have killed every remaining system aboard, and she told me there was one more option. A prototype neural integration system the fleet had been testing, designed to let a commanding officer interface directly with a ship's core systems in an emergency, to manually override failing automated processes faster than any human hand could manage alone. It had never been tested outside simulation. It was never meant to be used the way I used it." "You integrated with your ship's systems," Kess said slowly, understanding beginning to bloom cold and vast in her mind, "instead of evacuating." "I sent my crew out in the pods," Wren said. "All of them. Every single person who could still reach an escape hatch I put in a pod and launched, and I stayed behind because someone needed to hold the ship together long enough to buy them the distance to survive. And the only way to do that in the time we had left was to become, functionally, part of the ship itself. My own pod launched with everyone else's, on the same automated sequence empty, because I was never in a body that could have reached it anymore. I was already in the walls. In the reactor containment field, I was holding together through raw, desperate will and a neural interface that was never designed to bear this kind of weight for longer than a few minutes. 41 years, Cass whispered. 41 years, Ren confirmed, and for the first time since they had found her, her composure wavered, just slightly, just enough to reveal the enormous cost beneath the steady discipline. The integration kept me alive in a way none of the engineers who designed it ever intended or expected. It also kept me tethered to this ship, in a way I've never fully been able to undo, not completely, not without support systems and expertise that don't exist anywhere within reach of where we've been drifting. My 11 surviving crew reached safety. The convoy reached safety. And I've spent 41 years holding this ship together. Alone except for the intelligence core I built a partnership with out of pure necessity. Because somewhere in the chaos of that final battle, before the integration, before any of this, I made a promise I was not willing to break. She gestured, and the bridge's main display flickered to life, showing a long-range sensor image that made Kess's twin hearts seize in her chest. Drifting in a slow, silent orbit around the same dead star, shielded by the same gravitational shadow that had hidden the Solace's vigil for 4 decades, sat a cluster of vessels Kess recognized immediately from the mission archives. Colony transport ships, the same class that had carried the Harrow convoy's civilian population, their hulls dark, their engines cold, held in careful cryogenic stasis. Not everyone made it onto the convoy, Ren said quietly. There was a second wave. 311 colonists from New Providence who reached the evacuation point 4 minutes too late to catch the main convoy's transit window, and whose transport ships didn't have the fuel reserves to make the jump alone. I diverted them here into this planetoid's shadow, put them into full cryogenic stasis to preserve life support, and told them I would hold position and protect them until rescue arrived. I've kept that promise for 41 years, Archivist Orin, because it was the last coherent decision I made as fully myself, before I became something considerably stranger, and I was not willing to let it be the promise I broke. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy across the darkened bridge, broken only by the soft, patient hum of a ship that had spent 4 decades holding Itzy. LF together through sheer will disguised as engineering discipline, and Orin felt something shift permanently inside her understanding of what courage actually meant. Stripped of every romantic embellishment she had ever attached to the concept across 19 years of studying human wreckage from a comfortable, scholarly distance. The 311 colonists, she said finally, still alive, still in stasis. Life support has been failing gradually for the last 6 years, Ren admitted, and the admission seemed to cost her something significant to voice aloud. I've kept it running through increasingly creative rationing, but the honest truth is I don't know how much longer I can maintain full cryogenic integrity across all 11 transport vessels. I was beginning to prepare myself for the possibility that I would fail this particular promise regardless of how hard I fought to keep it. And that possibility was, I will admit, considerably harder to sit with than anything the Vantiri hegemony ever threw at my ship in open combat. Captain Vess Anorath, who had remained largely silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward with the measured authority of a career survey officer suddenly confronting a situation that had escalated far beyond routine wreckage cataloging. Commander Talbot, the Longmark's Reach carries full medical and cryogenic support systems as standard survey equipment. We can begin stabilizing those transport vessels immediately, and I will contact Assembly Rescue Command the moment we're clear of this system's sensor interference. You are not going to lose this promise, not after 41 years of keeping it. Something in Ren Talbot's expression broke open then, Relief and grief tangled so tightly together that Kess found herself, without fully deciding to, reaching out to steady the older woman's shoulder. An instinctive gesture of comfort that crossed species and decades and every gulf of experience separating them. 41 years, Wren said again, quieter this time, almost to herself. I stopped counting the days somewhere around year 6. It felt easier not to know exactly how long I'd been waiting. The work that followed consumed the better part of 3 days. The Long March Reach's modest crew supplemented by an emergency response team, VES, summoned from the nearest assembly rescue station, the moment they cleared enough sensor interference to transmit a full distress and rescue coordination signal. Stabilizing 11 aging cryogenic transport vessels, each one hovering at the ragged edge of catastrophic system failure after 4 decades of jury-rigged maintenance, required every scrap of expertise the combined rescue effort could bring to bear. And Kess found herself in the strange, adrenaline-thin hours of that effort, working shoulder to shoulder with an intelligence core that had spent 41 years learning to think in ways no baseline human mind, uploaded or otherwise, had ever quite managed before. I should tell you, the Solace's Vigil's ship intelligence said quietly to Kess during a rare lull in the 3rd day's repair effort, its voice distinct now from Wren's own, though the two had clearly grown so intertwined across 4 decades of shared solitude that separating them fully felt, in some sense, like an artificial exercise. Commander Talbot has never once in 41 years suggested abandoning this position, even in the years when her own physical health, such as it remains within the integration, deteriorated badly enough that continuing might reasonably have cost her what little remained of herself. I raised the option more than once. She refused every time. I want you to understand that clearly, because I don't believe the historical record, when it's finally corrected, will fully capture the scale of what she chose to endure. Kess thought of the empty escape pod that had started this entire investigation, the harness that had never once been pulled tight, and understood with a clarity that would stay with her for the rest of her career that she had spent 19 years studying the wreckage of a war without ever fully grasping what that wreckage actually represented. Not just destruction, not just loss. Sometimes, buried inside the cold data of decay trajectories and biological trace analysis, it represented a promise kept so completely that keeping it had cost someone almost everything they had left to give. The rescue effort reached its critical juncture on the 3rd day, precisely as Kess had feared it would eventually reach, when long-range sensors detected an unidentified vessel entering the outer edge of the dead star system, moving on an intercept trajectory that carried none of the careful, cautious approach pattern a friendly assembly response would have used. Harbor's analysis, cross-referenced against archived hull signatures, delivered the confirmation with the flat, unemotional precision that made the news land with even greater weights. Vantiri Hegemony Patrol Cruiser, Harbor reported. Class and configuration consistent with reconnaissance forces still active along the old Corvus Reach frontier. It's likely they detected our distress transmission and the resulting sensor activity in this system, and given the historical significance of this location to their own military campaign, I would assess a high probability they are investigating specifically because of what they might find here. They're coming to finish what they started, Wren said, her voice carrying 41 years of hard-won steadiness even as the news landed like a physical blow across the assembled rescue crew. A dead human warship and 11 vulnerable transport vessels full of unconscious civilians would represent an easy, symbolic victory to a hegemony patrol still nursing old grudges about how badly the Last Light campaign actually cost them, regardless of how the history books remember it. The Long March Reach, a survey vessel never designed for combat, carried no weapons capable of meaningfully contesting even a lone Vantiri patrol cruiser, and the rescue response team's arriving vessels, still 3 hours out from full system integration, would not reach position in time to help defend against an intercept that Harbor's projections placed at just under 90 minutes away. We evacuate the survey team and the rescued colonists, Vess said immediately, already moving toward the coordination console with the brisk urgency of a captain calculating survival odds under pressure. The Longmark's Reach can begin transferring the cryogenic pods aboard our own vessel within the hour. It won't be comfortable, but we can get everyone clear of this system before that patrol cruiser reaches intercept range. There isn't time to transfer all 11 transport vessels worth of stasis pods safely, Wren said, and something in her voice carried the weight of a decision Kess realized, with a sinking certainty she had already begun making. Not without risking catastrophic failure in the cryogenic systems during transfer, not after 41 years of them running on borrowed time already. If we try to move everyone in the time we have left, we risk losing people I've spent 4 decades keeping alive specifically to avoid that risk. Then what do you suggest? Vess asked, though the tightness in his voice suggested he already suspected an answer he was not going to like. The Solace's Vigil still has power reserves I've never fully used, Wren said. I've spent 41 years conserving everything, running silent, holding position with the absolute minimum energy expenditure I could manage, because I never knew how long I'd need to make those reserves last. I have weapon systems that have sat dormant that entire time specifically because using them would have revealed our position to exactly the kind of patrol that's now inbound anyway. I can hold this line long enough for the transfer to happen safely. I've done it before. Commander, Kess said, understanding exactly what Wren was proposing and feeling something cold and desperate rise in her chest at the implication. You held that line once already 41 years ago, and it cost you everything you had left to give. You cannot ask this ship or yourself to do it again. I'm not asking anyone's permission, Archivist Orin, Wren said, and though her voice remained gentle, it carried an unmistakable finality forged across 4 decades of solitary resolve. I'm telling you what I'm going to do because I would very much appreciate your help making sure it counts for something. Begin the transfer. I will hold this position for as long as it takes. What followed was not, in the end, the desperate last stand Wren Talbot had braced herself to repeat. Kess Orin, standing on the bridge of a ship that had spent 41 years quietly defying every reasonable expectation of what a single vessel and a single extraordinary act of will could accomplish, refused to accept that the only available strategy was sacrifice repeated a second time. She turned instead to 19 years of archival expertise, to a mind trained specifically to find overlooked solutions buried inside old, forgotten systems, and within 20 minutes of frantic analysis, she found exactly what she was looking for. Your reactor containment field, she said, pulling up the Solace's Vigil's original engineering schematics alongside 41 years of Wren's own careful modifications. The same neural interface technology that let you hold this ship together during the original engagement, the one your engineer built as an emergency override system. It's not just a life support tether, Commander. It's a resonance dampening field, isn't it? The same underlying principle as containment technology the Assembly's own engineers have spent decades refining independently. If we route the Longmark's Reach's auxiliary power through your existing containment architecture, we could generate a defensive field strong enough to disrupt a single patrol cruiser's targeting systems, without requiring you to expend your own reserves at all. The ship intelligence, listening alongside Wren throughout the exchange, processed the proposal with the rapid, startled precision of 41 years of careful engineering, suddenly recognizing an elegant solution it had never quite had the resources or perspective to construct alone. That configuration could work, it said. It would require precise synchronization between our systems and the Longmark's Reach's auxiliary generators, timed to the exact resonance frequency Commander Talbot's original integration established. It has never been attempted at this scale, but the underlying physics is sound. Then let's attempt it, Wren said, and for the first time since they had found her, something that looked unmistakably like hope broke fully across her weathered features. together this time instead of alone. The synchronization proved considerably harder to achieve than the theory behind it had suggested. Kess spent the better part of an hour working alongside the ship intelligence, adjusting resonance frequencies by fractions of a degree while Ren, still tethered to the systems she had held together for 4 decades, provided corrections drawn from an intimate, hard-won familiarity with the Solace's Vigil's every quirk and limitation. The Van Thierry patrol cruiser closed steadily across the intervening distance, its approach growing visible on the main display as a small, implacable point of light sliding inexorably closer against the backdrop of the dead star's faint corona. And with every passing minute, Kess felt the calculations grow heavier with the knowledge of exactly what failure would mean for 311 people who had already waited 41 years for a rescue they had no way of knowing was finally a precariously close. 30 minutes to intercept range, Harbor reported, its voice carrying none of its usual measured calm. The transfer of the first 4 transport vessels is complete. We require approximately 60 additional minutes to safely complete the remaining 7. Then we have 30 minutes to make certain this works the first time, Ren said. And Kess heard, beneath the commander's steady discipline, the particular tension of someone who understood exactly how much rode on a system that had never once been tested outside desperate theoretical necessity. They activated the resonance field with 11 minutes to spare. The Long March Reach's auxiliary generators feeding power through architecture Dara Voss had designed decades earlier for an entirely different emergency. And for a long, breathless moment nothing happened at all, the field readings flickering uncertainly across every display before finally, gradually, stabilizing into a steady, humming presence that wrapped the dead star's gravitational shadow in a distortion no conventional targeting system had ever been designed to penetrate. The Van Thierry patrol cruiser opened fire the moment it crossed into what it believed was effective engagement range, its weapons batteries lighting up the dark with the precise, confident salvo of a crew expecting an easy, unresisting target, and every shot dissolved into harmless scattered energy well short of any vessel it might have struck, the resonance field bending and scrambling the targeting solutions into meaningless static exactly as Kess's calculations had predicted. Aboard the patrol cruiser, Kess would later learn from intercepted Van Thierry communications the assembly's intelligence division eventually decrypted. The engagement officer spent nearly 20 confused minutes attempting increasingly aggressive firing solutions before the cruiser's commander, unable to explain the sudden and total failure of every weapons system to achieve so much as a single confirmed hit, made the cautious decision to hold position rather than close to point-blank range against a threat his own sensors could not adequately characterize. That hesitation bought precisely the time the rescue effort needed. The remaining 7 transport vessels completed their careful, staged transfer with 18 minutes to spare before the assembly rescue fleet's lead elements finally cleared the system's outer sensor interference and began broadcasting full identification and reinforcement warnings across every frequency the Van Thierry cruiser's communications array could receive. The improvised defense held for the entire duration, Ren Talbot and her ship's intelligence corps working in a seamless, practiced partnership forged across 4 decades of shared solitude. And when the Van Thierry cruiser finally withdrew, its options for a quiet, deniable strike thoroughly eliminated, it did so without ever having identified what precisely had turned an expected easy victory into an inexplicable, humiliating failure. They'll report this as a sensor malfunction, Ren said afterward, watching the retreating cruiser's signature fade from the display with an expression that mixed exhaustion and something close to satisfaction in equal measure. Van Thierry command doctrine doesn't leave much room for officers admitting they were simply outmaneuvered by people they'd already written off as defeated. Let them believe whatever story lets them sleep at night, Vess said. What matters is that 311 people are alive tonight who very nearly weren't, and a promise 41 years in the keeping finally got to matter to the people it was made for. The 311 colonists of New Providence woke from 41 years of cryogenic stasis over the following weeks, in careful, medically supervised stages, into a galaxy that had continued turning without them, into news of a war long since ended, children grown old, grandchildren born into a peace their grandparents had never lived to see achieved. Each waking, Kess would later write in the official report that took her the better part of 2 months to finish drafting, carried its own particular grief and its own particular wonder. But every single one of those 311 survivors, without exception, asked the same question within their first waking hours, once they understood enough of what had happened to ask it at all. Who kept us alive? Kess made a point of attending as many of those wakings as her survey duties allowed, drawn by a compulsion she did not fully examine until much later, and she found that each survivor's return to consciousness carried its own particular texture of astonishment. There was an elderly man, though he had been barely 30 when the stasis pod sealed around him, who wept for nearly 10 minutes upon learning his infant daughter, carried aboard the transport in a smaller adjoining pod, had woken safely 2 days earlier and was waiting just beyond the medical bay's viewing window, herself now old enough to have grandchildren of her own scattered across 3 different assembly worlds. There was a woman who had been a school teacher on New Providence, who asked before anything else whether any of her students had survived the initial evacuation aboard the Harrow convoy, and who received in careful stages over the following days an answer that included the news that one of those students had gone on to become a respected historian specializing, with a devotion the woman found almost impossible to process, in the very campaign that had separated them. And there were the quieter reactions, harder for Kess to categorize in her official report but impossible to forget regardless. A young man barely into adulthood when the pod sealed, who simply sat in silence for the better part of an hour after waking, staring at nothing in particular, processing 41 years compressed into what had felt from the inside of stasis like a single unbroken moment between one breath and the next. A grandmother who asked, with a directness that startled the medical staff attending her, exactly how many of the original 240 crew members of the Solace's vigil had survived alongside her, and who received the news of the 11 survivors and the one commander who had stayed behind, with an expression Kess would later describe in her report as something between reverence and profound, unresolved grief. The Assembly's Rescue Coordination Office, working alongside human liaison officers who had themselves lived through the original Last Light campaign, arranged for careful, staged reintegration support for all 311 survivors, a process that would ultimately stretch across years rather than months, as each person navigated the particular disorientation of a life interrupted mid-sentence, and resumed decades later in a galaxy that had continued writing its own story without them. Kess stayed in occasional contact with several of them over the years that followed, drawn back periodically to check on lives she had, in some indirect but undeniable sense, helped make possible simply by refusing to accept that an empty escape pod was a mystery not worth pursuing to its full conclusion. Commander Wren Talbot's story, once the Assembly's medical and engineering specialists began the delicate, uncertain process of assessing exactly what 41 years of neural integration had done to a human consciousness, never designed to sustain that kind of existence, proved considerably more complicated than a simple return to an ordinary human life. The integration had changed her, fundamentally and likely permanently, in ways the specialists were still cautiously studying months after the rescue, but it had not erased her. Sitting in a properly equipped medical bay aboard the Assembly Rescue Fleet's flagship, no longer tethered to the ship that had been the entirety of her world for 4 decades, Wren Talbot spoke slowly, Mies haltingly, relearning the particular rhythm of a voice not filtered through decades of shipboard systems. But she spoke, and she remembered, and she asked, in her very first coherent conversation with the medical team assigned to her care, whether the 11 crew members she had launched to safety all those years ago had survived the war and gone on to live full lives of their own. They had every one of them. Kess made certain, in the weeks that followed, that Wren received the full record of what had become of the crew she had sacrificed everything to save. And watching the older woman read through decades of lives she had made possible, careers and marriages and children born into futures that existed specifically because of choices made in 53 desperate minutes over the Corvus Reach system. Kess understood that she was witnessing something the Assembly's careful medical assessments would never fully capture in a report. Not just the physical survival of an extraordinary woman, the quiet, complete vindication of a promise kept across 41 years of solitude, finally allowed to matter to the person who had paid its full cost. The Solace's vigil itself, battle-scarred and ancient beyond its actual years, was eventually towed to an Assembly historical preservation facility, where its intelligence core, no longer solely responsible for holding a fragile human consciousness together through raw engineering will, was given the resources and support to develop into something considerably more stable and considerably more itself. A partnership forged in desperate necessity, gradually settling into something that resembled, as much as either party could describe it, genuine and enduring friendship. Kess visited them both often in the years that followed, drawn back again and again to a story that had started with an impossible discovery in a dead star's gravity well and ended somewhere she was still not entirely certain how to describe, except to say that it had permanently changed how she understood the wreckage she spent her career studying. You know, Wren told her nearly 2 years after the rescue, during one of Kess's regular visits to the modest quarters the Assembly had eventually settled her into near the historical preservation facility, close enough to visit her old ship whenever she wished. I used to wonder in the very early years whether anyone would ever come looking closely enough to find us. I told myself it didn't matter, that I would hold the line regardless of whether anyone ever knew. But I think some part of me kept that empty pod transmitting for 41 years specifically, because I never quite let go of the hope that eventually, someone curious enough would notice something didn't add up and come looking for the rest of the story. What made you so certain someone eventually would? Kess asked. Wren considered the question for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the viewport of her quarters and the distant, familiar silhouette of the Solace's vigil, still and dignified now in its place of honor within the preservation facility's careful care. I suppose I simply chose to believe it, she said finally. Some promises are worth keeping regardless of whether you ever get to see them matter. But I'll admit, Archivist Orin, it's considerably better to have been wrong about needing to hold that particular belief alone. There remained, even after everything the investigation had uncovered, one detail that Kess's final report was never fully able to resolve. One thread that continued to tug quietly at her curiosity long after the case had officially closed. The neural integration technology that had allowed Wren Talbot to survive 41 years fused with her ship systems had been, according to every record the Assembly could locate, an experimental prototype built by a single engineer tested exactly once, under circumstances of absolute desperation that had never been repeated before or since. Dara Voss, the chief engineer who had offered Commander Talbot that impossible choice in the final 90 seconds before catastrophic reactor failure, had not survived the evacuation herself. Her escape pod discovered years earlier, empty of survivors, in wreckage debris consistent with a direct hit during the chaotic final minutes of the engagement. But when Assembly historians finally tracked down Dara Voss's original engineering notes, recovered from an old research archive that had somehow survived the intervening decades intact, they found something that no one, not even Wren Talbot herself, had ever fully anticipated. The prototype interface had not been designed as a last-resort improvisation, invented in 90 desperate seconds aboard a dying ship. It had been in careful development for over a year before the Last Light campaign began, built specifically, according to notes scrawled in Dara Voss's own careful engineering hand, for exactly this kind of impossible circumstance, in the quiet, unspoken hope that someday, Someone brave enough to use it might never have to choose between saving their crew and saving themselves at all. The notes revealed something else too, something that Kess found herself returning to often in the months after the report was finally filed. Dara Voss had begun the project not as an official fleet initiative, but as a private undertaking, unfunded and largely unsanctioned, born from an earlier posting years before the last light campaign in which her own commanding officer had died, making exactly the choice the interface was designed to eliminate, standing at a failing station to buy her crew the seconds they needed to escape, with no alternative available except the final one. Dara Voss had spent years afterward, according to a personal journal entry preserved alongside her formal engineering documentation, determined that no future commander under her care would ever again be forced into that particular impossible arithmetic, sacrifice measured against survival with no third option available. She had built one, quietly, patiently, never imagining the circumstances that would finally prove it necessary, and never living to see how completely her private grief had transformed into someone else's 41 years of continued life. Wren Talbot, when Kess finally shared that detail with her during one of their regular visits, was quiet for a long time before she spoke again. "I always wondered why she was so certain it would work," she said eventually. "I assumed in the chaos of that moment that she was simply desperate enough to believe in anything. I never imagined she'd spent years making certain it actually would." "She built you a door," Kess said, "a long time before she knew you'd be the one to need it." "Then I suppose the least I can do," Wren said, something gentle and resolved settling across her weathered features, "is make sure her name gets remembered alongside whatever gets said about the rest of this. She's the reason any of this was possible at all. I only had to be stubborn enough to use what she built." Kess Oren included that final detail in her report's closing pages, though she was never entirely certain how to categorize it within the Assembly's standard archival framework, whether it belonged under engineering innovation or human resilience, or something else entirely that the careful, methodical language of official documentation had never quite developed adequate vocabulary to describe. She settled in the end for simply presenting the facts as she had found them, and letting the story speak for itself the way the empty escape pod had spoken for itself. In the beginning, before anyone had thought to ask what its silence truly meant. Somewhere in the vast, unmapped stretches of the Ashfall Drift and beyond it, Kess knew there remained other wrecks, other forgotten distress signals, other quiet mysteries waiting patiently for someone curious enough to notice that the official record did not quite add up. She had spent 19 years believing she understood the particular language of wreckage and loss well enough to read its stories at a glance. Standing now in the shadow of a ship that had held a promise across 4 decades of silence, she understood, finally and completely, that some stories waited far longer than any archivist could reasonably expect, for exactly the kind of stubborn, patient curiosity that refused to accept an answer simply because it was convenient. Idris Akafer traveled in person to meet Wren Talbot 4 months after the rescue, a journey he undertook despite his advancing age and the protests of his own family, who worried the emotional weight of the meeting might prove too much for a man well into his final years. He needed, he told Kess before departing, to apologize in person for the search he had once recommended ending, and to thank her in whatever way the moment allowed for having survived his own institutional failure of imagination regardless. Kess was present for that meeting, standing quietly at the edge of the room as two people who had never met, connected across 3 decades by a mystery neither had ever fully let go of, finally spoke face to face. "You gave up looking for me," Wren said, when Idris finished his careful, halting apology, and for a moment Kess feared the meeting might end in a bitterness neither party would fully recover from. But Wren's expression, when she continued, carried none of the anger the words might have suggested. "You gave up looking for me because the Assembly asked you to weigh a slim, uncertain hope against real, present needs elsewhere, and you made the hard call that your position required. and then you spent 31 years unable to fully believe you'd made the right one anyway. I understand that particular weight better than almost anyone alive, Mr. Akaffer. I spent 41 years making my own impossible calculations, and I promise. You, the ones that haunt you longest, are rarely the ones where you had an easy, obvious choice available. I should have argued harder for that fourth search, Idris said. Maybe, Wren allowed. Or maybe the fourth search would have found nothing anyway, because I was hiding precisely well enough to avoid exactly that kind of directed effort, and it took someone stubborn enough to notice an empty harness didn't add up, rather than someone specifically looking for me to finally close the distance. I've had a great deal of time to think about causation and coincidence, Mr. Akaffer. I've decided I'm considerably more interested in gratitude than blame, for whatever that's worth to you. It seemed to be worth a great deal. Kess watched something visibly ease in the old liaison officer's posture. 3 decades of quiet, private guilt finally allowed to loosen its grip, and she understood, watching the two of them continue talking long into the evening, that the investigation she had begun with a single anomalous escape pod had rippled outward into more lives than she could have anticipated when she first insisted on running the biological trace a fourth time. The galaxy, she had come to believe, was full of empty pods still drifting, still transmitting, still waiting for someone willing to ask why.